Time now to take a closer look at China's relations with Europe with Harlan Ullman. Harlan is a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council think tank here in Washington, D.C. Harlan, thank you very much. You know, it's the first time that the EU and China have had a summit in 2 years. Some could argue it is overdue and comes at a very important time. What are the key issues that Chinese officials wanted to get on the table, and did they get around to talking about them?
They didn't want to commit to anything. Unfortunately, the meeting was virtual, and meetings that are virtual have their own limitations simply because person to person is far better. At the same time, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a rather stinging report complaining about Indo-Pacific and the imposition of NATO and warning NATO not to become too involved, which is interesting at the time it's meeting with the EU. And as you know, there's a large overlap between EU membership and NATO membership. This was a meeting that really didn't establish very much. China's position is that it does not want to get too engaged with any of the parties because it thinks that being somewhat remote and removed is in its best interest. It says that it does not agree with any kind of territorial infringements of which Russia has been very guilty. On the other hand, it sees America in decline, and so by playing both sides against each other, Russia against the United States, China is trying to be aloof, and therefore, by not committing to any particular policy, causing uncertainty, indeed in Russia, but more importantly in the United States and the EU. And quite frankly, it regards the EU, even though the EU is a major trading partner, as far less significant than the United States and NATO. There's another point here. Because of the war in Ukraine, there's going to be a huge shortage of wheat, and that's going to affect China. And at some stage, the war in Ukraine is going to affect China economically. At that point, my guess is that China is going to be more interested in negotiating with the EU and the United States over economic reasons. But for the time being, as long as the United States has still imposed its tariffs on China, and those tariffs are hurting American consumers, not so much the Chinese, it seems to me that we're going to see more deadlock, more polite exchange of commentary, but very little action.
You know, Harlan, I've heard a lot of these points before, and I think a lot of people would say that they are certainly things that make sense. But looking at what China has done, saying that it wants to find some kind of peaceful conclusion to what's going on, that they haven't taken sides with Russia. What about that? Do you think that they have stayed out of this conflict in the kind of way? I'm sorry?
That's nonsense. Let me be very frank. If China wanted to take sides, it would say to Russia, back off. But it hasn't. And it's in the process of saying Russia is our closest ally, or one of our closest allies, and it's doing that for a very good reason. If China took a strong step, and if the United States were to say, China, maybe we'll consider reducing the tariffs or getting rid of tariffs, China could play a much more decisive role if it so chooses. Okay, but for the time being, it hasn't chosen to do that.
Let's talk about the economic link between the European Union and China as well, because it's become very important for Europe and indeed for China as well. Where do you see that moving, and how is that playing into the whole conflict, Russia-Ukraine?
The fundamental issue here is the European Union's reliance on gas and oil from Russia. This is a big deal. And so for the time being, China is going to have to make itself somewhat removed, but China understands if this gets unwound, and for example, if Russia were to cut off oil and gas, you have to realize that a huge amount of oil and gas flows through Ukraine, and that pipeline has not been cut. But if there is some cutting of oil and natural gas, that means Europe could be in a recession, and that's bad for China. So China is playing a very risky game here because you could see an economic collapse. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's a huge amount of vulnerability and reliability and dependence on Russian natural gas and oil. If for some reason that becomes severed, that's going to affect China over the long term because Europe is just going to stop producing things to a large degree.
Let's talk about where the relationship goes from here. How do you think the China-EU economic relationship is going to move forward, be repaired, mature, whatever term you'd like to use?
This is a function of the United States. I believe the United States has seen China as too much of a hostile power. And I don't say that as somebody who's welcoming China. There are a lot of problems in China. But going back to the Obama administration with the pivot to Asia, which alienated China and scared most of our allies, to the Trump tariffs, I don't know what the Chinese threat really is. Yes, it's increasing its military, but let me make this point. China has no capacity and will have no capacity to launch a major amphibious operation against China. I've made this point in China when I used to lecture there, so I think we've exaggerated the dangers militarily of China. Unfortunately, if the United States and China can agree on some kind of steps for reconciliation economically, that will help the EU-Chinese relationship. But I think it's all going to have to start in Washington and not in Brussels.
It's a little unfair, Harlan, but give me 15 seconds on how the U.S.-China relationship can be mended to a degree.
Very simple. Let's get rid of these tariffs. They're hurting American consumers. They're not doing any good. What are they supposed to do? We start there. Then I think we have to have nation-to-nation talks about how do we reduce these issues that are tensions between us. There's no reason that there has to be this hostility. I think we've exaggerated the threat, but China has also put us in a position where there are reasons that we are worried about what China's intentions are. We can sort those out as Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger did 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
40 years ago, indeed. Harlan Ullman, Senior Advisor at the Atlantic Council, thank you for your insight. We appreciate it.